So welcome to our Bible class. I believe this is our fifth class, and hopefully we are going to finish the Exodus. Are you ready for that? I was waiting for the time in which our class will coincide with the weekly portion that we read. And there is a good chance that this will be the class, because we are reading this coming Shabbat, the portion that is called the Torah, and it's famous because this is the first time in the Torah where we see the Ten Commandments. The second time will be in the book of Deuteronomy. We'll talk about probably maybe even next week towards the end. Okay, and today we'll talk about the Ten Commandments, or at least about the function that they were supposed to serve, to fulfill. If you remember last week, we finished with the story of the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac. Just want to remind you of one thing. We talked about the covenant between God and Abraham. Okay, we're going to use this term covenant quite a lot. Covenant is a treaty, an agreement. The covenant between God and Abraham was the second out of 4 covenants in the Torah. The first one was with Noah. After the flood, God promised Noah and everyone else that there will never be such a devastating event like the flood. God will never decide to wipe out everyone and everything. And in return, God just wanted people to follow what we call the 7 Noahide commandments, some very basic rules, including do not kill, do not murder, do not steal, etc. That's what God wanted. Second covenant with Abraham is quite surprising because it follows very well the model of the ancient covenants between the suzerain and the subjects, or the vassals, in which the suzerain, the king normally, did something good for his people, and because of that he demanded that there will be subjects. As subject, they had to agree to behave in a certain way, and obviously to give the king what the king needs, and in return the suzerain will protect them, etc. But when God cut his covenant, and this is I say cut the covenant because this is the biblical verb that is being used. When God did it with Abraham, established a covenant with Abraham, even though God is the suzerain, God did not expect Abraham of anything. God just promised Abraham for Abraham to have children, to grow into a big nation. He promised him success. He promised him a land. But Abraham did not need to do anything, which is quite unusual. Today we'll see the third covenant, which will be the part of the 10 Commandments. This time, God and the people of Israel. But we have some time to the 10 Commandments. We ended with the story of Isaac. And Isaac, when we read about him in the Torah, you see very little. He's almost like a transitional patriarch between the first one, Abraham, and the third one, Jacob. We hardly have stories about him, except of stories that were not really about him, but people in his family. So we know that his wife, Rebecca, just like his mother and just like his daughters-in-law, was barren and found it hard to have children. Eventually, they prayed to God, and God gave them 2 children, Esau and Jacob. Now, to remind you, Isaac was the second son of Abraham. The first one was, remember, Ishmael, the son that was born to him with the handmaid Hagar. But despite the principal the biblical principle that the firstborn child has to inherit the father. The firstborn has to continue the legacy, the spiritual legacy. And the book of Deuteronomy says it very clearly. It says that even if a man has two wives, one of them he loves, the other one, not so much. But the other one, the one he doesn't love, gives birth to the first son. This is the main heir. A man is not allowed to favor the second-born or the third-born son because he is the son of his favorite wife. It's an explicit law in the Torah. Nevertheless, all the patriarchs dismissed it. So Abraham favored Isaac versus Ishmael, and we'll see now that Isaac will favor Jacob, even though Jacob was born after Esau, and we'll see the same pattern when Jacob would have 12 children, and he favored Joseph and then Benjamin, who were born way, way after the rest of them. These two boys of Isaac and Rebekah gave them a hard time. They were twins, but despite being twins, Esau came out first, and Jacob didn't like it. Jacob always saw himself in competition with his brother. He wanted to be his brother. He wanted everything his brother had. I don't know if you grew up with siblings and had similar experience, either if you were the older or the younger. And he did anything in his ability to try to get what his brother had. And he never hesitated to use tricks. He was known as the trickster of the Bible, and often did things that are completely unethical. For example, when his brother Esau, who was a hunter, came back after a long day in the field, very hungry, famished, that's the term in the Bible, and asked Jacob to share some of the lentil stew that Jacob had prepared. Instead of doing the right thing, to be a mensch, Jacob said, "Oh, you want my stew? You have to sell me your birthrights." Not the brotherly thing to do. And by the way, probably nobody can sell birthrights. So even though Jacob wanted him to do it, that's not something that anyone can do. Definitely the parents don't have to regard it as a valid thing. But it shows us the kind of character that Jacob had. Later on, when he heard that Father Isaac was about to give the blessing, and I'll say more about blessings. Back then, blessings were really important, because by a blessing, Isaac, first of all, designated Esau as the heir of everything, not just money and property, but really the spiritual direction that Abraham started, Isaac continued, and he wanted Esau to continue. Jacob didn't like it. So he and his mother decided to take advantage of Isaac's blindness. He was already, Isaac the father was old and blind, and Jacob dressed up like his brother Esau. We read that Jacob had smooth skin, but Esau was hairy. So he took some animal skin, put on his arms, and went to the father after he prepared a nice dish for him and said, "Father, I'm Esau, your son. I'm ready to get the blessing." Isaac was blind, but not stupid nor deaf. And he said, "Your hands feel like the hands of Esau, but your voice is the voice of Jacob." And Jacob continued, said, "Father, it's me, Esau." And he received the blessing. Okay, so he was a trickster. That's how he started. Nevertheless, he is our most important patriarch. As you will see in a second, Abraham was the patriarch with the blind faith. Right? God told him, "Take your son and kill him." What did Abraham do? Took his son, schlepped him for 3 days to the mountain that God showed him, and was ready to kill him. Not Jacob. Jacob did not trust God or anyone else. He needed proof. He protected his own interests first. So he wanted a blessing, he wanted the birthright. However, after his brother Esau realized that he was tricked and the blessing that was meant for him was stolen by his brother, he was angry. And he said, oh, I'm going to kill this guy. We are not sure that he meant it literally, because that's something that siblings say. I have two brothers, and a line like, I'm going to kill you, was not a rare occurrence in our home, but Esau was a hunter. He was a man of the outdoors. Later on, we know that he even had a group of men who often walked with him, and Jacob was a tent dweller, as he's described in the Torah. He preferred to stay with his mom, I don't know, cooking, doing some domestic task rather than going out to hunt. So if Esau wanted to kill him, Esau knew how to do it. So Jacob, after receiving the blessing, had to flee, had to run away back to Mesopotamia. Right now they're in the land of Canaan, which is Israel today. And he ran back to his uncle, his mother's brother, Laban. Let me admit somebody. And he went there, and on the way, he stops and goes to sleep, and he has a dream. And this is the famous dream of a ladder, a stairways to heaven, in which angels go up and down. And modern scholars describe it probably as the place that people believed connected heaven and earth. Because when you think about it, if the gods are there and we are up there and we are down here, we need a mechanism with which to connect heaven and earth. And that was the place where Jacob decided to spend the night. Of course, he didn't know about it. So he had a dream and saw the angels go up and down. And during this dream, God appeared to him and promised to take care of him, promised to protect him, and repeated the promise that he gave his father and grandfather, that he will be a father and patriarch of a large nation, and he will end up in the promised land. When Jacob opened his eyes, there is a beautiful passage there. He says, I realized that there is God in this place, and I didn't know that. Jacob did not really have this relationship with God. That was his first encounter. But even though he had a dream and he had a feeling that God was there, even though he was blessed by God, he's still not sure, because he continued with this beautiful few lines and he said, God, if, and that's a key word, if you protect me, if you fulfill your promise to me, if you, God, will make sure that I will return safely to my home, then you will be my God. And then he says something that I always thought was really sweet and said, and then I'll give you 10% of everything I have. I think it's really nice, but all these ifs, okay? He's the businessman, just the opposite of Abraham. And it seems like God likes it, because Abraham demonstrated blind faith, and we're not sure that God was so impressed. Perhaps God wanted Abraham to say, when God said to him, kill your son, maybe God wanted to say, okay, God, I draw the line here. I'll do anything you want, but that's not what I'm willing to do. Yes, please, just unmute yourself.
So I have a question. So, I mean, you said earlier that God never really made demands from Abraham, but I agree with that 100% or 99.9%. But the Akedah, that was the first time he actually demanded something from Abraham. And I've read some things about the test or whatever. Abraham was doing all this stuff and followed God, blindly until then he said, well, there was always something in it for Abraham. But the Akedah was the first time that there was nothing in it for Abraham. And it was the first time God actually asked something of Abraham. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
I'm happy you asked it, because the question, because you gave me an opportunity to clarify, first of all, what I said. I said that during the establishment of the covenant between God and Abraham, it was a unilateral event. God said, I'm giving, and at that moment, God has not asked Abraham to do anything. Okay? So that's important, because we'll see the covenant later on with Moses and the people of Israel, in which there are two sides, like an agreement that you're having when you buy a house, right? So, but I know that was not your entire question. That was the first time you said that God asked Abraham to do something. I'm not sure about it, because the Jewish tradition talk about the 10 trials of Abraham. The last one was the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. The first one was when God told him, Lech Lecha, go forth, get out of your birthplace and go to the place that I will show you. And then we have a whole line of less requests, but expectations at least.
Right, but Abraham, and every time he did that, God said, and I will make you a great nation, and I will give you children, and I would. So every time he asked Abraham to do those other 9 things, he kind of repeated, "Hey, I'm going to do those 4 things for you," and it was like repetitive the whole time. But this is the first time he said, "You're going to do this for me, and I'm not offering you. I didn't tell you I'm going to do all this stuff, and it." Now, I'm not sure it's right. I just read that somewhere, and so I wanted your feeling that this is the first time he didn't offer something to Abraham.
It's something that I need to check, but when I just go very fast in my head about the entire story, I think you're right. Because each time when God tells him to do something, there is if, and then I will do all that for you. When it comes to the Akedah, there is no then, just do it. And more, I think that God expected Abraham to say no. I really think that the test was no. And I'll tell you why. There are many reasons, but one of them is the fact that God does not talk to Abraham afterwards. The last time that God talks to Abraham is when he tells him to sacrifice his son. And then nothing, not a word. We don't hear that God is angry, but as I mentioned many times, the beauty of the text is that it's so economical. And what is written and what is not written is very important. It's not something that we make up later on as readers and try to write a nice sermon. It really meant by the authors of the text. And I think that Jacob became the father of the people of Israel, and his name will be changed to Israel, and I'll talk about it in 3 minutes or so, is because God wanted more than blind obedience. God wanted this back and forth, and God wanted to see growth. So Jacob started as a trickster, and then he had to learn a major lesson, that a person who tricks a lot is being tricked. Because when he finally arrived in Mesopotamia, he had to stay with his uncle, who was a master trickster. And he had to teach him a lot of lessons. One of them was that Jacob first met his cousin Rachel and was smitten immediately. And he went to her father, his uncle, and said, I want to marry Rachel. And Laban said, absolutely. It's better for me to give her to you than to a stranger. But I want you to work for me for 7 years. It was an exuberant price, but Jacob was in love and said, I will do it. And as probably some of you remember the story, after 7 years of hard work, a wedding, first night with the bride, he woke up in the morning and realized that he spent the night with the sister of the bride, with Leah, the less physically attractive sister whom he did not want. When he went to his now father-in-law / uncle and said, what did you do? You cheated me. Why did you do it? Laban said, well, in our place, we don't switch the young and the old. And it was a clear reference to what Jacob did. Jacob pretended to be the older in order to steal the blessing from Esau. And his uncle said, that's not what we do. We first married the oldest daughter and then the younger. And if you want to marry Rachel as well, work for me for another 7 years. Okay, that was an important lesson. And then there are some business dealing with Laban that he has been constantly mistreated and cheated. After 14 years of working and few more years of staying in Mesopotamia, Jacob felt that it's time to go back home. He had enough living under the roof of Laban. He wanted to be his own man. There was only one problem about going back home. His brother, Esau, was there. And even though it was almost 20 years later, you can never be sure if Esau was still angry. But he was willing to take the risk. He did something quite nice. He spoke to his wives. I mean, today we take it for granted that before we make a big decision, we talk to our wives, I hope. But back then it was an interesting thing to do. It was unusual. He told them how he felt, very honestly, how he has been mistreated and humiliated by their father. It's not a stranger, and how much he desires to live. And they said, we'll follow you. You're our family now, and our loyalty to you is much more important than our loyalty to our father. And that would happen. But he was still worried about his brother. As he came closer to the promised land, to Canaan, he got the news that his brother Esau was walking towards him with a group of 400 men. The Bible normally exaggerates when it comes to big numbers. Often they are in the family of 4. So it's 4, 40, 400. Okay, we'll see. 40 years in the desert. Moses went on Mount Sinai for 40 days. The slavery in one source lasted for 400 years. So we like this number, but Esau was prepared, or at least one could have interpreted it as being prepared for a fight. Jacob decided to do a few things. First of all, to offer him some major gifts, because when he left his father-in-law, he left with a lot of property, a lot of animals. And then he divided his camp into 2. He sent everyone ahead with the hope that if they are attacked, he will be attacked, but his family and the others will be safe. They all crossed a little river by the name of Yabok. And this is an important incident that took place there. They crossed it, and he stayed on the other side of this river during the night. And again, he falls asleep. And then something fascinating happens. A man comes, and it seems like this man is a messenger of God, definitely has some divine qualities, it's not very clear, and starts struggling with him. They're fighting all night. And during this fight, Jacob hurts his hip, but the man was not able to defeat Jacob. When morning came, the man said to him, "Let me go." And Jacob said, "I will not let me go until you tell me your name." Names in the Bible are really important. Not only that they have a meaning, but knowing someone's name, especially in the right context, means that you have power over them. But Jacob said, "Give me your name." And the man said, "No, I will not give you a name, my name, but I'll do two things. I'll give you a blessing and I will change your name." Because Jacob is not a very flattering name. Jacob literally means heel grabber. Because we have a little description that when Esau, remember they were twins, right, in their mother's belly, and Esau was about to come first. Jacob was jealous, didn't want him to be the firstborn, so he grabbed his heel and tried to pull him down in order to be the first to get out. And that's why his name is Jacob. Okay, so from the Hebrew word akev, which really means a heel. Not the most flattering one, but now, after these 20 years of being a trickster, deceiving people, being deceived, he was ready to assume a new name because he turned to be a different kind of a person, and his new name will be Israel, which means you struggled with God and prevailed. And I believe, and it's not only my opinion, is that that's the kind of a person that God was looking for. Right? Remember, God in the beginning, God didn't know what to do with these people to whom he gave free will. So they were bad, he killed them all with Noah. Also, after Noah was not so happy, and then he decided to choose one specific person, Abraham, and it seems like this blind obedience, blind faith was not good enough. But Jacob, as he was growing, seems to appeal to God. And God said, "Okay, your name is now Israel." And the story continues from there. Anyone wants to ask anything or to make any comment? Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, didn't Abraham argue with God when God wanted to eliminate Sodom and Gomorrah?
I believe we discussed it last week, or at least I meant to.
Right, so he did argue with him, and I thought God liked that.
I think that he argued with him and God liked it, and then he ruined it by his willingness to kill his son.
Oh, I
I
see.
think God wanted him to be consistent.
So he didn't continue on his growth path.
Yes.
I see.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
He started to show some character, but then when God said something, again, I'm not sure that that's true, that's right, but it seemed like God lost interest in him. It was not good enough. That's why we continued with
Probably felt
more
betrayed.
generations, but that's a good point.
Okay, thank you.
Jacob had 12 sons and at least one daughter. When I say at least because only one daughter is mentioned in the Torah, but she's mentioned because something happened to her, which I believe he probably had more, but the Torah normally does not mention women unless there is a reason. The Torah will mention names because they were important enough to be mentioned, but women, you needed to do something. And in this case, the daughter, Dinah, just happened to be a victim of a rape. So that's why she's mentioned. I don't know if any of you had the chance to read The Red Tent, which is a whole book by Anita Diamant that was based on this chapter of the book. It's a beautiful book. She did a very good job with that, and with many other projects that she was taking on herself. But the 12 sons of Jacob later on became the 12 tribes of Israel. So even though Reuben was the firstborn, and Simeon was the second, and Levi was the third, and Judah was the fourth, he loved Joseph because Joseph was the son of his beloved wife, Rachel. Okay, he had 12 sons from 2 wives and 2 of their maids. So they were wives, the maids, of a lesser degree, which was common back then. Okay, there was the main wife, or in that case, main 2 wives, and then they had their maids who were sort of a concubine status. He did exactly what Abraham did and his father Isaac did by preferring not the firstborn. And Joseph, who grew up in a situation in which he knew that he was the favorite son, and we know the story of the coat of many colors that Jacob made for Joseph in order to make it very clear for everyone who was interested that Joseph is the chosen one, was a spoiled brat. And not only that, he knew how to make his brothers really angry with him. He would go to them and tell them about some dreams that he had of how one day he would rule over them. He would go to spy on them, only to go back to Jacob to tell on them, to tell about all the bad things that they did. They hated him so much that when they recognized an opportunity to get rid of him, they seized it. So initially, they just threw him into a pit in the desert, expecting him to die of hunger, thirst, or some animals.
Sorry?
But then Judah, and it's important that it was Judah, came up with a different solution and said, you know what, why just killing him? Let's make some money. But they pulled him out and sold him to a caravan of Ishmaelites as a slave. And then you remember the story. They took his famous coat of many colors, dipped it in an animal blood, went back to their father Jacob and said to him, do you recognize this coat? They didn't say that he died, but Jacob, just looking at the coat soaked in blood, said, I lost my son Joseph died, an animal just killed him, and he has been mourning his beloved son all that time. In the meanwhile, Joseph did quite well in Egypt. It took him some time because as a slave he excelled, but he remained smart and ethical. First, he was the slave of one of the ministers in Egypt. The Bible rarely describes definitely men as good looking, but Joseph was described as a good looking man. And the wife of his master liked him a little bit too much. And she tried to convince him to have sex with her, and he refused. He said, I would love to, but I'm loyal to my master who treated me so well. Till there was one episode in which she grabbed him, he ran away, and she was left with his tunic, with his garment in her hands, fearing that Joseph would say something first. She started yelling, rape, rape, rape. And when the guards came, she said, this Hebrew guy tried to rape me, and he was thrown in prison. While in prison, he met 2 of the Pharaoh's ministers, the butler and the baker. And they had weird dreams that they couldn't understand their meaning, but Joseph could. By the way, in Egypt, it was the art of interpreting dreams was quite well known and quite important. They told their dreams to Joseph, and Joseph said to the baker that he will end up on the stake, on a tree dead. And he told the butler that he will be restored back to his lofty position. And sometime later, that's exactly what happened. The only thing that Joseph asked the butler when he is back at the palace was to mention him, Joseph, to the Pharaoh. He said, I'm here, even though I didn't do anything wrong. So please talk to the Pharaoh and try to release me. The butler promised to do that, so, but very quickly forgot. So Joseph stayed in jail until the Pharaoh had a dream. And even though the Egyptian people, his advisors were very smart, he didn't like their interpretation of the dream. He felt that there is something deeper there that they miss. And at that point, the butler heard of it and said, you know what, when I was in prison, I met this Hebrew guy and he was just on the money. He knew how to interpret my dreams, our dreams, mine and the baker's. Why don't we call him? The Pharaoh liked it, brought him, gave him a nice shower, put nice clothes on him. The Pharaoh told him the dream, and actually two dreams with the same meaning, and Joseph knew what they meant. He said that Egypt is going to have 7 good years of rain, of good crop, but these 7 good years will follow by 7 bad years. The Pharaoh realized that it was the right interpretation, but he didn't know what to do with it. So he asked Joseph if he has an idea, and Joseph had. Joseph said, we in Egypt now having this insider information, we should save all the grain we can during the 7 good years, because when the 7 bad years will start in the region, nobody will have food, we will have food. Low supply, high demand, high prices, we will be even richer than anyone else. And the Pharaoh loved it. So the way the story goes, 7 years, they built garrison cities, they filled all the storage places with as much food as they could. And when the famine arrived, nobody in the area had food. They all had to come to Egypt because Egypt had food. In the beginning, they had some money because after 7 good years, you have some savings, but then they didn't have money, so they have to sell their animals to the Pharaoh and the land to the Pharaoh. And some people even had to sell themselves as slaves to the Pharaoh. By the way, I know it's a Bible study, but some people who write anti-Semitic treatises love this story because for them it's a proof of how unethical and money-obsessed the Jews are, and how, in this case, Joseph took advantage of the poor people around to become rich. Even though he personally did not become rich, he just helped the Pharaoh to become wealthier, but some people who don't like Jews love this particular story. Because again, it's a proof of the true nature of the Jew, who is obsessed with money, with profit, and doesn't really care about anything else and would take advantage of anyone. Just in parentheses, it's not for the Bible, but sometimes it's important to notice things like that. Joseph became the main advisor for the Pharaoh. He was in charge of all the food distribution. And sometime later, when there was no food in Canaan, Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy food. And you know how the story unfolds. It's a beautifully written story. There is a good reason it became the inspiration of some modern stories and some plays and some musicals. They came. They did not recognize Joseph because he looked like an Egyptian, but he recognized them immediately. But before he was ready to reconcile with them, he needed to test them. Because I started to hint that it's very important in the Bible for people not to start perfect, but to show that they can grow, that they can reform. So you can start really as a trickster, or like Joseph, as a spoiled brat, but you have the ability to grow or not. So Joseph wanted to see if his brothers changed from the time when they sold him into slavery. He played some games with them, but the main one was he told them after that they told him first that there is one more brother that they have. His name was Benjamin, but he stayed in Canaan with their father because he was the only son the father had of his beloved wife, Rachel. Okay, Benjamin was Joseph's only full brother. Rachel had two sons before she died. After Jacob saw that Joseph died, his beloved son became Benjamin. So when the brothers went to Egypt to buy food, he said, "You're not traveling anywhere. You're staying here with me." But Joseph said, "I want your brother here if you want to get food." And at that point, and that was the important transition, it was Judah, the one who came up with the idea of selling him to the Midianites as a slave, stood up and said, "Don't do it. Don't do it to us. Keep me here as a pledge, as a collateral, because we cannot do it to our father. If our father will lose his son Benjamin, it will be the end of it. So keep him in prison instead of Benjamin." At that moment, Joseph recognized the shift in his brothers. He realized that, like him, like others, they grew, they became different kind of men. He couldn't hold it any longer. He asked all the Egyptians to leave the room, and he cried and he said, "I'm Joseph, your brother. Is my father still alive?" And that was this climax of the story. Yes.
So Joseph is in Egypt for 15 years. He loved his dad. Why didn't he ever get word to his dad that he was okay?
So that's $1 million question, or 64. I don't know what's the rate today. And your answer is as good as anyone's. The nice thing that, at least for me, I read these stories every single year for now almost 50 years. And it really depends where I am in life on the answer that I give or the answer that I like that other people give.
Well, here's an answer
Many
I
of
have.
Sorry?
Here's an answer I have. One of the things, so he knew Jacob knew Joseph's brothers hated him, but then he said, "Hey, why don't you go check to see what your brothers are doing, and you come back and tell me." And did Joseph think that his father was part of this whole plot? Because he said, "Go check on your brothers," and then brothers threw him in the pit, and then he sold them to Egypt. So I read a thing that maybe that's why he was actually mad at his dad, because maybe he thought that his dad was part of the whole plot to sell him.
So this is one answer of a family of different answers that Joseph was mad with his dad, yes. Either because he thought it was part of the plot, or because he realized that the way that he treated him with favoritism led to his demise, etc. But there was anger there, that Jacob did not do his job as a father correctly, and Joseph was the one to pay the price. This year, at least, I believe that Joseph really thought that he was able to start new life. And sometimes people who start, or at least believe that they can start new life, try to disconnect all the relationships, all the ties with the place from where they came. And I'll give you a a little bit, it's not a proof, but a few ideas to support it. Immediately he married an Egyptian wife. Not that there were many Jewish girls in Egypt at the time, but he tried to hide the fact that he was a Hebrew to the best of his ability, spoke only Arabic, he changed his clothes, he changed his language. And he was in a new land. I heard enough stories of people, of Jews who came from Eastern Europe or came to America initially in order to bring their families from Poland and forgot to do that. And it's not only Jews, of course, but I heard it in a Jewish context. So maybe that was part of it. His life there was so good, he didn't want to risk anything. He wanted to be perceived as a real Egyptian, not to show that he had ties with these Canaanites. I'll take it to somewhat a different direction that I was considering. I may talk more about it next week. The Canaanites were not always considered favorably in Egypt. When you look at hieroglyphs, it's very easy to recognize the Canaanites. They looked much darker. They look like people of a second class. There was a time when a non-Egyptian group of people, the Hyksos, took over Egypt. And there was a dynasty of Hyksos, of non-Egyptians, who were sort of Canaanites, but not necessarily, but they were foreigners who controlled Egypt for many years. And perhaps that was part of it. So now many people think that as immigrants, we made it and we don't want to risk it. But there are many good reasons. The traditional commentators never forgave Joseph for that, because the mitzvah of honoring one's father and mother is part of the Ten Commandments, and it appears in different ways in the Bible. And no matter what kind of reason Joseph had, he still could have sent a message to his father to say, I'm alive. Because we know that the biggest fear that any parent has is losing a child, and mourning for 15 years for a son is not right. And he was in a position to send at least a message, even if he were angry, right? That's a torture. But that's part of the beauty, again, of the story. Our characters are not perfect. None of them is even close to. So Joseph was smart. Joseph did some good things. Joseph was able to forgive his brothers, but he had many flaws. And let me just see somebody, hopefully nothing. I thought that it's about somebody from the class trying to send me a message. The brothers, by the way, did not believe that Joseph ever forgave them. They thought that he was pretending to be a nice guy to impress their father. And when Jacob, the father, would be dead, he will take his revenge. But Jacob did forgive them completely. And he even told them that it was not their fault that he ended up in Egypt. It was all part of God's plan. He said, God sent me here to save life of many people, and your life and our family as well. This story does not mention God a lot, hardly at all, but it's very clear that God is behind the scenes. God had a plan, and this is all part of God's plan, God's providence, if you will. And that's more or less how the story ends. the people of Israel, the 12 brothers with their big families, they all arrived in Egypt. The Pharaoh is very generous with them. He gives them the land of Goshen on the northern part of the Nile, the Delta. He exempts them from military service and some other kind of services for the kingdom. And on the account of Joseph, they have very good life. And that's how the book of Exodus begins. But sometimes later, a new Pharaoh rose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And instead of seeing Joseph and his family as assets, as part of Egypt, as a group of foreigners who contribute to the success of Egypt, he saw them as a threat. Some scholars, as I mentioned before, take us back to the story of the Hyksos, of these foreigners who took over Egypt. And they said that that was the reason, and maybe there is some historical reference that the Canaanite or the Hebrews were these Hyksos, but there is a lot going on among people who try to show how this story is historical. I will not do it right now because we can have fun with this for about 2 hours in a completely, no, it's really fun. I'm not just saying it. I have done it probably a decade ago, but it's really fun to take everything that we know from Egyptian history, archaeology, and from the Bible, and to see how things work. The only thing I will tell you, to this day, there is no proof that the Joseph story, that neither this Joseph story nor the Exodus story happened. It is not to say that it necessarily didn't. It definitely didn't happen the way the Torah describes it. But it was written against a backdrop of some historical facts from Egypt. But we'll have fun. If anyone wants later on, I'll be happy to take some pieces of our big class and dedicate all the time that we need, and I'll bring the right documents, etc. So new Pharaoh didn't like the Hebrews, first tried to kill them. But remember, God was always in the background there. He told the midwives that every Jewish or Hebrew woman who gives birth to a boy, the boy has to go into the river. Only that the midwives who were assigned to take care of the Jewish women refused to do it. And when the Pharaoh confronted them, they just said, oh, we cannot deal with these Hebrew ladies. They give birth so fast that by the time we come, they already have the baby and it's too late for us. And there is a debate whether or not these two midwives were Hebrew or Egyptians. The language is very ambivalent because they are described as the Hebrew. It can be the Hebrew midwives. So it can be that they are Hebrew and they're midwives, or the midwives of the Hebrews. Okay, so in Hebrew, you can easily read it in both ways. But it is important that they were the first one, the people to disobey the Pharaoh were women. And against this background, we read about the new important person in the life of the Jewish people, Moses. Moses' mother gave birth to him. We don't even know his father's name. It was not important, but we know his mother's name, Yocheved, gave birth to a nice baby. Because of the Pharaoh's decree to kill the Jewish boys, she hid him. But after 3 months, she realized it was too dangerous. So you know the story. She put him in a nice basket and placed the basket on the Nile, sent her daughter, again, another female, Miriam, to watch over the baby. And she herself, there is an interesting scene there, that when the Pharaoh's daughter saw this beautiful baby in the basket, Miriam ran to her and said, I just know a woman who can nurse the boy. And the Pharaoh's daughter was happy, and so she called her mother, who was Moses's mother, and she nursed him. At least she spent the first, I don't know how long she did it, but at least she spent some time with him as long as he was nursing. I want to mention two little things that are important that are clear in Hebrew. The word for a basket that was used for this scene is teva. The only other time that the word teva is mentioned in the Torah is during the story of Noah and the ark. So the ark of Noah was called teva. Okay, this is not the ark that we have in the temple. This is not the ark that the Torah will talk about later. The word for that is aron. I don't know why the English word is ark for all of that, but the word teva in Hebrew is important because you see how the connection between Moses and Noah, how a person is being saved from water by this vessel teva. And I will talk next week about the connection between the Hebrew God and water. Okay? And not only that, we have the connection of teva, a vessel that saves people from drowning in water, like Noah and Moses, but also she placed him not just in the middle of the Nile, but she placed him by the reeds, R-E-E-D. And this is important because later on, when God will split up the sea, this is not the Red Sea as is conventionally and wrongly known, but this is the Reed Sea. It has nothing to do with the Red Sea. Okay? And there's a clear reference that Moses started his life by the reeds, and then he defeated the Egyptians by the Sea of Reeds. Okay? And the irony there is even greater, that the one who saves Moses is the daughter of the same Pharaoh who wanted to kill them. And this Pharaoh, Moses will be raised in the Pharaoh's home. Okay, so the Pharaoh raised the one who will lead to his demise. So the irony is obviously there. We know very little about Moses as a young man. Actually, we know two things about him that are quite similar and give us more than a hint to why God wanted him to be the leader of the Jewish people. The first story, now Moses is a little bit older. He decides to go and see what's happening outside of the palace. And he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating up a Hebrew slave. He intervenes and kills the Egyptian. Probably overreacted. He knew he did something wrong because he hid the body of the Egyptian. He made sure that there were no witnesses, and he hid the body. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting, and one Hebrew strikes the other one. And he went to the one who was striking and said, "Why are you doing it to your friend?" And then they both said to him, "Oh, are you going to kill me now the way you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses realized that the secret has been revealed and he was in danger. So he escaped from Egypt. He ran away to the desert, to Midian. And the first thing we read about him is that he stopped by a well. Well is a very important place in the in a Bible that was the center of a town when people meet, when people did what they needed to do, did business. And some daughters of the Midianite priest of Jethro being harassed by some guys, some men, male shepherds, and he immediately intervened to help them. So Moses, from the very beginning, cared a lot about helping the underdog. It was his business, even though he was never asked to help, it was his business to help. He ended up marrying one of these shepherds or shepherdess at Zipporah, and he was quite content being a shepherd in Midian. Probably spent some 40 years there until, and I'll pause soon, one day as he was walking with his flock on Mount Horeb, and Mount Horeb has another name, Mount Sinai. They're being used interchangeably in the Bible, in the Torah, in the whole Bible. Horeb or Sinai, we normally use Sinai, but Horeb is very prevalent. And as he was there, he saw the sight of the burning bush, right? He saw a bush on fire, but it has never been consumed. And as he was staring at the burning bush, he heard a voice, Moses, Moses, I'm the Lord. You have to take your shoes off because that's how you behave in a sacred place. And Moses was afraid and he covered his face. And then God told him, I have a mission for you. I want you to go to Egypt and tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses said, I don't want to do it. Choose somebody else. It's not for me. And God, no, you're doing it because when God wants you to do it, you really don't have a choice. And Moses tried to get out of it unsuccessfully. He said, oh, I'm not a good public speaker. Choose my brother Aaron, who is really good at this stuff. But no. And that's where I'm going to end, because that's where I more or less started. Moses is asking him, okay, what is your name? Remember the story of Jacob and the angel? What is your name? And God says the words, Eheye asher eheye, different translations, I am who I am, I will be who I will be. Later on, people recognize it as the acronym of the name of God, Yahweh, or as some modern scholars suggest, I am who I am means I'm not going to tell you. I'm God, and if you know my name, if you know my essence, you will have some control over me. So I am who I am. It's just, I'm not telling you. So there was nothing deep there, just a way to say, I'm who I am. What's your name? So that might be the case. And from now on, we are going to see the struggle between Moses, the Pharaoh, the 10 plagues, but I think we'll pick on it next week. You're more than welcome to read. Here's the way the book of Exodus is divided. The first 15 chapters are the story of the Exodus, our Passover thing, but the climax of the Exodus is not just the Exodus, not just now we're free from slavery. Two things happen. Both of them are really important. The first one is the third covenant, which when Moses received the Torah, right, on Mount Sinai, and I'll show you how is it a covenant and the characteristics of this covenant. And the second thing was building a place for God. This is the tabernacle, okay? So these two things now will be very important for the people of Israel forever. A physical space and a law or instructions, the Torah. Does anyone want to say something, to ask something? Okay, so we'll end here and pick the story up next week with the Exodus and the plagues. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.